Today we will be looking at bankruptcy filing trends by chapter in the state of New Hampshire. To do this, we have about a dozen charts showing bankruptcy activity in the state going back to 1990. All this filing data comes from the Administrative Office of the United States Courts. This first chart shows total filings by year since 1990. During that time, there have been a little over 100,000 cases filed in the state. In the early 1990s, filings were running generally between 3,000 and 4,000 per year. A little bit higher in the later 90s, with some ups and downs, getting up to 5,000, dropping down to around 4,000 again. The big increase was in 2005, the year of bankruptcy reform, where just prior to the October effective date, filings really surged. And so that was the peak year in the state, followed by a large decline the next year where filings dropped off down to under 2,000. This was followed by 4 years of large increases, and filings got nearly up to the 2005 peak, but higher than any other year before that. And then since then, filings have dropped down by more than 60%. And so right now, filings in New Hampshire are well below where they were in 1990, even though most states are a little bit above where they were, but New Hampshire is actually below. And only about one half of what they were in the years prior to bankruptcy reform. Now, this next chart shows filings relative to population from period 1990 to 2015. On this chart, red is the highest rates, and more than 25% above average, and particularly in the southeast, you see the highest bankruptcy rates. Yellow is the lightest, where it's more than 25%, and New Hampshire is actually right on the border of being, the difference between them being in the yellow-colored states is only about one case per year. But the bankruptcy rate in New Hampshire is really quite low compared to the population. Looking at it this year by year, in the early 1990s, you can see that New Hampshire, this blue line here, is very close to the national average. By the late 1990s and prior to bankruptcy reform, they were during these years they were about 35% below the national average. And then since 2006 through to 2015, they've been about 22% below average. This chart shows Chapter 7 filings by year since 1990, and it very much looks like the chart for total filings, but you had around 3,000 filing cases per year in the early 90s, up around 4,000 most years up until 2004. The spike in 2005 with the huge drop-off the next year. Then filing has more than tripled as the recession took hold, and then have dropped by two-thirds since then. And so you can see that Chapter 7s are now well below where they were in 1990, and down by more than half since from what the typical average was prior to bankruptcy reform. Looking at Chapter 11 cases in New Hampshire, in the early 1990s, there were a number of cases. The volume was fairly high. Part of this decline is due to the increased Chapter 13 debt limits, but virtually every state had a large decline throughout the 1990s. In New Hampshire, from about 1995 to present, it's averaged about 30 per year, a little bit higher during and after the Great Recession. And in 2016, on pace for only about 20 cases in the state. Looking at Chapter 13 cases by year, and this is a very different pattern than the other chapters. You can see that from 1990 to about 2001, filings were running just around 300 per year. It increased to 500 or so up through 2006. Then a big jump up from 2007 up to through 2011. But during this period, filings were running about 1,000 per year, and then have dropped off very substantially from then. And So right now, Chapter 13s in the state are somewhere pretty close to where they were just before bankruptcy reform, and well above where they were back in throughout the 1990s. Looking at the percent of cases that are filed as Chapter 13s, the national average has been about 30% for a number of decades, actually, with some disruption before and after bankruptcy reform. In New Hampshire, they're running under 10% until about 2005, and in recent years, about 20 to 25% of cases in the state have been Chapter 13s, which is getting closer to the national average, but is still a ways below it. Now, this next chart shows the unemployment rate by quarter in New Hampshire compared to the national averages since 2006, and this is kind of a proxy for how the economy is going. And you can see that New Hampshire has always been quite low relative to the national average, and particularly during the Great Recession, filings topped out at, unemployment rate topped out at about 6.6%, which is where nationwide it got up to nearly 10%. And right now, the national has gotten much better, around 5%, and New Hampshire's down around 3%, which is one of the lowest in the country. But overall, this shows that the impact of the recession was probably less in New Hampshire than in most other states. Filings peaked most recently nationwide in September 2010 and have dropped nearly 50% during that time nationwide. The rate of decline has been the amount of decline in New Hampshire has been 65%, which is one of the highest in the country. And actually, the largest declines, these would be states colored red, tend to be most of New England and in the Southwest. And the smallest declines have been throughout the southeastern part of the country. But New Hampshire's up there right near the top at 65%. Looking at the decline quarter by quarter, you can see that in New Hampshire with the blue columns here has been going down right around 20% nearly every quarter since 2011, where the national has been more in the 10 to 15% range. The last couple of quarters, you can see that the rate of decline both nationwide and in New Hampshire has slowed down, but it's kind of an unclear pattern. And in a state that has so few cases, it doesn't take much of a change to really move that the positioning on the graph. But overall, in the first 6 months of the year, nationwide filings were down around 6%, and New Hampshire was closer to 8%. In the third quarter, it looked like filings were down 17% over third quarter in 2015. So I think overall what this means is that there will be about 1,800 cases filed this year in New Hampshire, which will be the lowest since sometime the 1980s. Probably another decrease in 2017, and maybe slight increases in later years. But I don't see any return to the 4,000 to 5,000 cases filed per year that New Hampshire saw during, say, from 1997 to 2004, unless another recession hits or some sort of legislation affecting bankruptcy eligibility. Well, that concludes our look at bankruptcy filings in New Hampshire. For more statistical information and other information on bankruptcy, be sure to visit the newsroom section of the ABI website at www.abi.org.